In this video, we're gonna deploy two applications, MongoDB and MongoExpress. And I chose these two because it demonstrates really well a typical simple setup of a web application and its database. So you can apply this to any similar setup you have. So let's see how we're gonna do this. So first we will create a MongoDB pod. And in order to talk to that pod, we are gonna need a service. And we're gonna create an internal service, which basically means that no external requests are allowed to the pod, only components inside the same cluster can talk to it. And that's what we want. Then we're gonna create a MongoExpress deployment. One, we're gonna need a database URL of MongoDB so that MongoExpress can connect to it. And the second one is credentials, so username and password of the database so that it can authenticate. So the way we can pass this information to MongoExpress deployment is through its deployment configuration file through environmental variables, because that's how the application is configured. So we're going to create a ConfigMap that contains database URL, and we're going to create a secret that contains the credentials. And we're going to reference both inside of that deployment file. So once we have that set up, we're going to need MongoExpress to be accessible through a browser. In order to do that, we're going to create an external service that will allow external requests to talk to the pod. So the URL will be HTTP IP address of the node and the service port. So with this setup, the request flow will now look like this. So the request comes from the browser, and it goes to the external service of the MongoExpress, which will then forward it to the MongoExpress pod. The pod will then connect to internal service of MongoDB. That's basically the database URL here. And it will forward it then to MongoDB pod, where it will authenticate the request using the credentials. So now let's go and create this whole setup using Kubernetes configuration files. Let's dive right into it and create the whole setup. So first of all, I have a Minikube cluster running. If I do kubectl get all, which basically gets me all the components that are inside the cluster, I only have a default Kubernetes service. So my cluster is empty and I'm starting from scratch. So the first thing that I said we're gonna do is create a MongoDB deployment. I usually create it in an editor. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio Code and paste a prepared deployment file there for MongoDB. And this is how it's going to look like. So I have deployment kind and I have some metadata. I'm just going to call it MongoDB Deployment. Labels and selectors. In the previous video, I already explained the syntax of Kubernetes YAML configuration file. So if you want to know what all these attributes mean, then you can check out that video. And here in the template, I have a definition or blueprint for pods that this deployment gonna create. And I'm just gonna go with one replica. So the container is gonna be called MongoDB, and this is the image that I'm gonna take. So let's actually go and check out the image configuration for MongoDB. So Mongo, and I see this image here. Let's open this. And basically what I'm looking for is how to use that container, meaning what ports it's gonna open and what external configuration it's gonna take. So a default port of MongoDB container is 27017. So I'm gonna use that. And we are gonna use variables, environmental variables, the root username and root password. So basically I can, on the container startup, define the admin username and password. So let's go ahead and configure all of that inside the configuration file. So here below the image of MongoDB, so we're just gonna leave the name of the image and it's gonna pull the latest one. And that's what we want. So here I'm gonna specify what port I want to expose. So ports, that's the attribute name, and container port. And that's the standard port, so I'm gonna leave it. And below that, I'm gonna specify those two environmental variables. So one is called, let's see what it's called. It's Mongo initdb root username. And here is going to be value. So we're going to actually leave it blank for now. And the other one is called init root password. And we're going to leave that blank as well, just value. And once we have the values here, we're going to have a complete deployment for MongoDB. This is basically all we need. Now, note that this is a configuration file that is going to be checked into a repository. So usually you wouldn't write admin username and password inside the configuration file. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create a secret from where we will reference the values. So meaning that the secret is going to live in Kubernetes and nobody will have access to it in a Git repository. So we're going to save this incomplete deployment file, first of all. So let's call it Mongo Deployment, or let's just call it Mongo YAML and save it here so that we get the syntax highlight. And now, before we apply this configuration, we're going to create the secret where the root username and password will live. So let's create a new file. And I'm going to paste in the configuration of a secret, which is actually pretty simple. So we have a kind secret, then we have a metadata, which again is just simply the name. We're going to call it MongoDB secret. The type opaque is actually a default type, which is the most basic key value secret type. Other types, for example, include TLS certificates. So you can create a secret specifically with a TLS certificate type and a couple of more types. But mostly you're going to use the default one, and these are the actual contents. So you have the data, and here you have key value pairs, which of course are the names you come up with. So we're going to specify username, or we can actually call it Mongo root username, and we're going to call it Mongo root password. And here's the thing, the values in these key value pairs are not plain text. So when we are creating a secret, the value must be base 64 encoded. So the way you can do that, the simplest way is go to your terminal. So here I'm going to say echo -n, very important option, don't leave it out, otherwise it's not going to work. And here I'm going to put a plain text value that I want. So I'm just going to go with just username, whatever. Of course, you can have something more secretive here. And I'm gonna base 64 encode it. And the value that I get here, I'm gonna copy it into the secret configuration as a value. And I'm gonna do the same with password. So again, I'm just gonna go with simple password. Obviously you want to have something more secure. And I'm gonna copy that as a value here and save it as Mongo secret.yaml. Okay, now we have only written configuration files. We haven't created anything yet in the cluster. So this is just preparation work. And we have to create secret before the deployment if we're gonna reference the secret inside of this. So the order of creation matters. Because if I'm creating a deployment that references a secret that doesn't exist yet, I'm gonna get an error, so it's not gonna start. Since we have our first component, let's actually go ahead and create our secret from a configuration file. So again, I'm gonna go to my console. Let's actually clear all this, and I'm gonna go into the folder where I'm creating all these configuration files. I called it Kubernetes configuration, and here I have both of my files. So I'm gonna do kubectl apply Mongo secret and secret created. So I'm gonna do kubectl get secret, and I should see my secret has been created. This is something created by default with a different type, and this is our secret here. So now that we have our secrets, we can reference it inside of our deployment configuration file. So let's go back. And this is how you reference contents, specific key value data of secret. So instead of value, we're going to say value from. And then I'm going to do secret key ref or secret key reference. And name is going to be the secret name. So this one here. And key is going to be the key in the data. I want the value of this key value pair. So I want this part of the data. So I'm going to reference it by key. So you don't have to learn it by heart, obviously, all the syntax and attribute names. Important thing here is that you know approximately how to reference it. The actual syntax you can always look up in Google or maybe from previous configuration files. But yeah, this is how you reference it, and we're going to do the same with password. So I'm going to do from, and I'm just going to copy the rest here. Remember, YAML is very strict with the indentation. Here is the same secret, but a different key. So I'm going to use password key here, and that will be it. So now we have the root username and password referenced from the secret and no actual values inside the configuration file, which is good for security because you don't want your credentials in your code repository. Okay, so our deployment file is actually ready. So let's apply that. kubectl apply. And the deployment created, meaning if I do get all, I should see the pod starting up, the deployment, and the replica set. So let's actually check how pod is doing. Container creating. So let's actually watch. It might take some time to create it. If it takes long, and if you want to see whether there's a problem there, you can also do kubectl describe pod and the pod name. So at least we know nothing's wrong there. So we see that it's just pulling the image. So that's what it takes so long. So let's see again, kubectl get pod. And as you see, it's running. So we have MongoDB deployment and the pod, one replica of its pod running. Now the second step is we're going to create an internal service so that other components or other pods can talk to this MongoDB. So let's go ahead and create service configuration. So go back to YAML. And here we can either create a separate YAML configuration file for secret, or we can also include it in the same one. So in YAML, you can actually put multiple documents in one file. So if I put 3 dashes, that's basically a syntax for document separation in YAML. So a new document is starting. So actually I'm going to put both deployment and service in one configuration file because they usually belong together. So here I'm going to paste the service configuration. And by the way, I'm going to put all these configuration files in Git repository and link the repository in the description of this video. So this is a service for MongoDB. Let's go through some of the attributes here. So it's the service kind, just the name. We're going to call it MongoDB service. Selector. This is an important one because we want this service to connect to the pod, right? And the way to do that is using selector and label. So using this here, the labels that deployment and pod have, service can find the pods that it's going to attach to. Right, so we have the selector here, and this is an important part where we expose service port. So this is going to be the service port, and this is going to be the container. And since we exposed container port at this address right here, these two have to match. So target port is container or pod port, and this is the service port. And obviously these two here can be different, but I'm going to go with the same port. And that's basically it. That's our service. So I'm going to create the service now. So let's save this file and go back to my console. And I'm going to apply the same file that I applied before to create deployment. So let's see what happens. See both deployment and service configuration, but it's going to know that I haven't changed the deployment. That's what it means here. And a service is created. So if I were to edit both, for example, I can reapply the file and deployment and service can be changed. So I think using local configuration files is a handy way to edit your components. So now let's actually check that our service was created. Get service. And this is our service. And it's listening at port 27017. And I showed it in one of the previous videos, but we can actually also validate that the service is attached to the correct pod. And to do that, I'm gonna do describe service, and I need the service name for this. So here I have the endpoint, which is an IP address of a pod, and the port where the application inside the pod is listening at. So let's actually check that this is the right pod. I mean, we just have one, but still. So if I do get pod, and I want additional output to what I get by default, one of the columns includes the IP address, which is this one right here. So 172.17.06. That's the pod IP address, and this is the port where the application inside the pod is listening at. So everything is set up perfectly. MongoDB deployment and service has been created. And by the way, if you want to see all the components for one application, you can also display them using kubectl get all. That will show all the components, and you can filter them by name. So MongoDB. And here you see the service, deployment, replica set, and the pod. So when you do all, the component type will be the first here. Okay, that's just a side info. So now as the next step, we're gonna create MongoExpress Deployment and Service, and also an external configuration where we're gonna put the database URL for MongoDB. So let's go ahead and do it. So I'm gonna clear that up and go and create a new file for MongoExpress Deployment and Service. So this is the deployment draft of MongoExpress. Same things here, MongoExpress, that's the name. And here we have the pod definition where the image name is MongoExpress. Let's actually go ahead and check that image as well. We don't need this. This is MongoExpress. And that's the name of the image, MongoExpress. And let's see the same data here. Let's see the port. The MongoExpress application inside the container starts at is 8081. And these are some of the environmental variables. So obviously we need three things for MongoExpress. We need to tell it which database application it should connect to. So obviously we need to tell it the MongoDB address, database address it should connect to, the internal service, and we're gonna need credentials so that MongoDB can authenticate that connection. And the environmental variables to do that is gonna be admin username, admin password, and the MongoDB endpoint will be this here. So these three environmental variables we need. So let's go ahead and use that. So first we're gonna open the port. Again, container, ports. And the reason why you have multiple ports is that inside of the pod, you can actually open multiple ports. So that's gonna be 8081. And now we're gonna add the environmental variables for the connectivity. So the first one is the username. And this is gonna be obviously the same username and password that we defined right here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna copy them because it's really the same. So the value from, we're gonna read it from the secret that's already there. So I'm gonna paste it here. Second environmental variable is called admin password. And I'm also gonna copy that from here. And the third one is gonna be the database server. And since this is also an external configuration, we could either do value here and we could write the MongoDB server address directly here, or as I showed you in the diagram at the beginning, we can put it in a ConfigMap, which is an external configuration, so that it's centralized, so it's stored in one place, and also other components can also use it. So for example, if I have two applications that are using MongoDB database, then I can just reference that external configuration here, and if I have to change it at some point, I just change it in one place and nothing else gets updated. So because of that, we're going to keep this incomplete deployment configuration, and we're going to create the ConfigMap, which will contain the MongoDB server address. So I'm going to create a new file. Let's actually save this incomplete deployment. Let's call it MongoExpress YAML, and we're going to come back to it later. So save that. Now we need a config map here. So I'm going to copy the configuration, and this is also pretty simple. Just like secret, you have the kind, which is config map, the name, and the same construct. See, just like you saw here, data, which is key value pair, it doesn't have a type because there's just one config map type and that's it. And here you again have key value pairs. So database URL and server name is actually the name of the service. It's as simple as that. So what did we call our service? We called it MongoDB service. So I'm going to copy the service name, and that's going to be the database server URL. So I'm going to copy that, and let's actually call it Mongo config map for consistency, and save it. And just like with secret, the order of execution or creation matters. So I have to have a config map already in the cluster so that I can reference it. So when we're done, I have to create the config map first and then the deployment. So the way that I can reference the config map inside the deployment is very similar to secret. So I'm actually going to copy the whole thing from secret, put it here. The only thing different here is that instead of secret, I'm going to say config map. It's all camel case. And obviously the name is going to be config map. That's what we called it, I think. Yes, that's the name. Let's actually copy it. And again, the key is the key in the key value pair here. So let's copy that as well. So now I have our MongoExpress deployment. These are just standard stuff. And this is where the pod blueprint or container configuration exists. We have exposed port 8081. This is the image with the latest tag. And these are the three environmental variables that MongoExpress needs to connect and authenticate with MongoDB. So deployment is done, and let's go ahead and create config map first and then MongoExpress deployment. kubectl apply config map, and I'm gonna do kubectl apply MongoExpress. And let's see the pod. So container creating, looks good. So let's see the pod, and it's running. And I actually want to see the logs. So I'm gonna lock the MongoExpress. And here you see that Express server started and database connected. So now the final step is to access MongoExpress from a browser. And in order to do that, we are gonna need an external service for MongoExpress. So let's go ahead and create that one as well. So let's clear this output, go back to Visual Code. And as we did last time in the same file as the deployment, I'm gonna create MongoExpress service. Because actually in practice, you never have deployment without the service, so it makes sense to keep them together. And this is MongoExpress external service. And this configuration right now looks exactly same as the MongoDB service configuration. And even the ports are the same. Like here, I have exposed service port at 8081, and target port is where the container port is listening. So how do I make this external service? Is by doing two things. So in the specification section, so I'm going to do it below the selector, I'm going to put a type. And the type of this external service is load balancer, which I think is a bad name for external service because internal service also acts as a load balancer. So if I had two MongoDB pods, the internal service would also load balance the requests coming to these pods. So I think the load balancer type name was chosen not very well because it could be confusing. But what this type load balancer does basically is it accepts external requests by assigning the service an external IP address. So another thing that we're going to do here to make this service external is right here we're going to provide third port. And this is going to be called node port. And what this is basically is the port where this external IP address will be open. So this will be the port that I'll have to put in the browser to access this service. And this node port actually has a range. And that range is between 30,000 and 32,000 something. So I can not give it the same port as here. As I said, it has to be between that range. So I'm just going to go with the 30,000. That's the minimum in that range. And that would be it. So this configuration here will create an external service. Let's go ahead and do it. And I will show you exactly how these ports differ from each other. So I'm going to apply Express. So service created. And if I do get service, I see that MongoDB service that we created previously has a type of cluster IP. And the MongoExpress service that we just created is load balancer, which is the type that we specifically defined. An internal service, we didn't specify any type because cluster IP, which is the same as an internal service type, is default. So you don't have to define it when you're creating internal service. And the difference here is that cluster IP will give the service an internal IP address, which is this one right here. So this is an internal IP address of the service. And load balancer will also give service an internal IP address. But in addition to that, it will also give the service an external IP address where the external requests will be coming from. And here it says pending because we're in Minikube and it works a little bit differently. In a regular Kubernetes setup, here you would also see an actual IP address, a public one. And this is another difference because with internal IP address, you just have port for that IP address. With both internal and external IP addresses, you have ports for both of them. And that's why we had to define third port, which was for the external IP address. As I said, pending means that it doesn't have the external IP address yet. So in Minikube, the way to do that is using the command minikube service, and I'm gonna need the name of the service. So this command will basically assign my external service a public IP address. So I'm gonna execute this and the browser window will open and I will see my MongoExpress page. So if I go back to the command line, you see that this command here assigned MongoExpress service a URL with a public IP address or with an external IP address, and the port, which is what we defined in the node port. So I can basically copy that command, which is the same as this one here, and I get the page for MongoExpress. So now with this setup, the way it's going to work is that when I make changes here, for example, I'm going to create a new database, let's call it test DB, whatever, and I'm going to create a request. What just happened in background is that this request landed with the external service of MongoExpress, which then forwarded it to the MongoExpress pod. And the MongoExpress pod connected to the MongoDB service, an internal service, and MongoDB service then forwarded that request finally to the MongoDB pod. And then all the way back, and we have the changes here. So that's how you deploy a simple application setup in a Kubernetes cluster. Thanks for watching the video. I hope it was helpful, and if it was, don't forget to like it. This is a video series, so I will create a new one every week. So if you want to be notified whenever a new video comes out, then subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions, if something wasn't clear in the video, please post them in the comment section below and I will try to answer them. So thank you and see you in the next video.